you've been writing a letter with Chris Philp. To whom and why?
That's right. Well, look, we're very concerned about the fact that two men last year were arrested for spying for China, spying against
2023, I think.
Sorry, 2023.
Yeah, when you were in government.
That's right. They were arrested, and CPS wanted to bring them to trial and asked the current government to provide information so that they could. And that information wasn't forthcoming, and consequently, the trial hasn't been able to proceed. And we think that this is incredibly serious. And so yesterday, Kemi Badenoch responded to the statement that Dan Jarvis, the Security Minister, had in the House of Commons. And we were very disappointed that there was no explanation for why that information hadn't been provided to the CPS.
Well, they say they've given the information. They may not have given the information you or the CPS wanted, but they've given the information.
Well, they've given some information, but they haven't given the information the CPS wanted.
Yeah.
And myself and Chris Philp, Shadow Home Secretary, have written to the Director of Public Prosecutions in order to ask if the government now provided the right information, could the trial proceed? That we're very keen that these two men who've been arrested, there are grounds for believing that they may have spied for the Chinese state.
Which they deny.
Which they deny, but there are grounds for believing that they may have done. That trial happens if it possibly can. Because at the moment, really what we're saying to spies around the world is you can come and spy on British members of Parliament and you may get away with it. And that's totally unacceptable.
Do you really think that's what's being said? What the government is saying, because Steve Reed was sat there an hour ago talking about this, what they're saying is the accusations levelled at these men have to be based in the time in which they were levelled, which is 2023.
Either they were stealing information from British parliamentarians and handing it to China, or they weren't. But you understand that's how spying works.
Sure.
And it's nothing. It's actually, in principle, it's nothing to do.
But you also know how the legal system works, and there's the element of precedent set by a case earlier in the summer, which prevents the government from retrospectively saying they were a threat to national security at the time, when in fact the Conservatives are in government.
Well, the Conservative government did call them a threat, and I'm sure you listened to the statement yesterday, which Kemi Badenoch read out all of the times in which the Conservative government called the Chinese state a threat. But the fact is, if you take, I understand these men deny it, but for example, if you take a job in Parliament, you take information off MPs and you pass it to another country for spying purposes, that's against the law. You can't just do that. Yeah. And so there ought to be a trial, and it's very serious that the government has not been able to facilitate that trial.
But is it the Director of Public Prosecutions who needs to be asked these questions? Surely they can bring the case regardless of what the government does or doesn't say, can't they?
Well, it's clear that they required information that the government didn't hand over. And it's not just the Conservative Party saying this. There are former heads of MI5 and former heads of MI6.
Yes, Mark said,
that's right, former heads of the civil service who say that this is highly irregular and that it doesn't make sense. And so, look, we will continue to put pressure on the government to, at the very least, explain itself.
But again, we asked Steve Reed that question. When it's secretive information that is under the Official Secrets Act, which legislation has now changed, which they say you should have changed when you were in government because it dates back to 1911, they can't reveal to us exactly what they've shared. You say they're hiding behind the legislation.
We have means in Parliament to deal with with secret information.
Yeah.
So, for example, the Intelligence Select Committee, Security Intelligence Select Committee, can sit in camera, can sit in private, very often, part of its regular business, handles secret information. They could ask their National Security Advisor and their Deputy National Security Advisor to go and give evidence to that committee, and then that committee would just be able to report in a very high-level way to the House as to what had happened. There are lots of options available to the government, but the government is stonewalling. The government doesn't want to cooperate, and that makes everybody, understandably, think that there is a cock-up and a conspiracy going on here.
If you get your way, and there is a case brought against these men, how fair a trial could they get, given all this potentially prejudicial discussion that's happening right now?
Well, the evidence will speak for itself, and I'm sure that the court will be able to handle it.
You think there's obviously a smoking gun here. You think this is some sort of Watergate moment. Do you think it's going to make a difference to the Conservatives' fortunes?
Look, our job as an opposition is to point out where the government is making mistakes. That's part of obviously we want people to vote Conservative at the next election, but we also have a duty on behalf of the British people to make sure that the government is held to account when it does things that are wrong, and that's what we're doing today.
Do you think this kind of thing shifts the needle in your favour, perhaps more than policy ideas? Because the latest polling out today shows that, while well received on the day, Kemi Badenoch's speech at the Tory party conference and ideas about getting rid of stamp duty were welcomed in some quarters, it's making no difference to the polling. The latest polls show, in terms of voting intentions, no change with the Reform on 27%, no change with Labour on 20%, no change with the Conservatives on 17%. What can you do to change that?
We have 4 years in order to make our case. To the public.
Less than 4 years now.
Well, 3 3/4 years.
Yeah, and, so not 4 years.
Yeah, exactly. So 3 3/4 years. But look, you're a very, very good interviewer. You're quite right to put me up on those 12 weeks. And if
that's the length of a general election campaign, isn't it? So you tell me.
In the 3 3/4 years that we've got, obviously, we have to rebuild trust with the British people and show that we're the ones that have meaningful answers to the very serious issues that are arising over the economy under this Labour government. We've seen the unemployment figures out today, up again, up to 4.8% from 4.1% at the last general election. A lot of people out of work, a lot of people claiming benefits now because of the mistakes that this government made in the budget last year. So look, we know that this is a long road, but we will be using all of that road in order to make our case for why this government has to go, why Reform have no answers on the economy, and why it's got to be the Conservative Party that will restore the country's fortunes.
They're not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Their look may change, but they're not going to go for 3 3/4 years, as you rightly point out there. How can you shift that needle if the polls stubbornly remain the same, with you lagging a distant third, 10 points behind Reform?
We know that
could there be some sort of pact, some sort of agreement with Reform?
No, look, we're not talking about that, and we're not planning on that at all.
You might have to at some point.
What we're interested in doing is setting out exactly what needs to be done in order for the country to recover its fortunes. That means bringing down public spending so that we can bring down taxes, so that we can get growth. We're the only party that has brought forward carefully thought through plans in order to achieve that, and we will carry on making that case, because ultimately we know that the British people are going to be worse off after 3 3/4 years of this Labour government, and that they're going to need a party to come in that understands business, understands how to improve the economy more generally, and understands how to restore the country's fortunes.
It's still, even though we are way beyond a year after the election, it's still a hard pill for some to swallow that you're going to cut public spending when it was the civil service that absolutely ballooned under the Tory stewardship.
The civil service grew first under Brexit and second under COVID. I think lots of people understand why it expanded under COVID, but you'll have seen at Conservative Party conference that we set out plans to reduce the level of the civil service back to where it was in 2016. We know how to do that, and that will save considerable amounts of money, which we can put back in the pockets of the British people.
Just a quick question to finish off, and I put the same question to the government in the form of Steve Reed earlier. There's this story in the Times today, you may have seen it, that a mosque banned female fun runners from taking part in a fun run in Victoria Park in Hackney in East London at the weekend. Boys and men of all ages ran in it. Girls under the age of 12 were only allowed to run in it. The East London Mosque denied breaking equality legislation. But what do you think about that case?
I haven't seen that story, but based on what you've just said, I'd be very worried if women and girls are being excluded from any sort of activity like that, particularly when men and boys aren't. So,
you think it should be looked at?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't think that's sort of discrimination we want to see in modern Britain.
Alex Burghart, thank you.